Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 217th ICMDA seminar. Today we have Dr. Trevor Stammers talking to us about the determination of death. It's my great privilege to introduce an old friend, Trevor Stammers, who is a former GP and a bioethicist. He was a course director of a master's course in medical ethics at St Mary's, Twickenham, and author of a recently published and very good book on organ donation, which I do recommend if you have an interest in these in that issue. He's going to be talking to us on the determination of death. So, Trevor, without further ado, let me hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and particularly for the plug of the book, which has related matters to what we'll be talking about today. Well, I hope that you can cope with the competing rain that's battering down on the roof. I hope that's not too much of a distraction. This is where we'll be going. Just some general comments about the concept of death. Then we'll be looking at some brain death dilemmas, circulatory death dilemmas, the dead donor rule, and some more specifically Christian reflections on these issues at the end. So, what is death? Death has had various conceptions throughout the ages. Plato was probably one of the earliest philosophers, predating obviously the New Testament, to describe the separation of the soul from the body. One of my favorite quotes about death comes from a early 1600s play called The Duchess of Malfi, where the Duchess says, "I know death hath 10,000 several doors from which to take their exits. And 'tis found they go on strange geometrical hinges. You may open both ways." The last part of that is because the idea of the dead coming back as ghosts or spirits was much more common in those days than before. But her comment about the actual methods of death being many thousands are clearly still true. But the Bible, I think, pretty clearly indicates that the general rule from the letter to the Hebrews there, that we are certainly as humans destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. So a serious matter, both from the point of view of our mortal bodies dying, but also that we need to wisely use the one life that we have. But the fear of being prematurely declared dead is a very deep-rooted fear that also dates back widely through history. And on the left-hand side there is a picture of a charnel house. And these were very common in earlier centuries in graveyards, particularly during times of plague when the dead could not be buried quickly enough. And the charnel house was a place where corpses and sometimes skeletons were stored until they could be buried. But rich people would sometimes have a private charnel house on their estate. And if they died, often left instructions that they were to be laid out in the charnel house for several days before burial to make sure that they were indeed dead. And the picture to the right is from a Wikipedia article on the fear of premature burial, with a device from the late 1800s, supposedly making it impossible for you to be buried by mistake with these circular handles on the inside of the doors, so that if you woke up after you were interred in them, you'd be able to turn the handle to get out. I find it a bit worrying that there doesn't appear to be a handle on the outside, so I'm not quite sure how they were secured, but there we are. Now, assuming that one is dead, there are obviously various stages at which death can be confirmed. And once a corpse reaches the stages of decomposing and putrefaction, I think there's very little dispute that the person has died. And equally, once one has excluded hypothermia, if the body is cold. But the areas that have the most controversy relating to them are those third, fourth, and fifth ones there that I'll be spending most of the time on during this seminar. Now, of course, it's modern technology that has led to most of these dilemmas of determining death arising, and the advent of the external respirator, the iron lung, early on in the 1900s, followed by the development of ventilators and advances in cardiopulmonary resuscitation and defibrillation, means that, of course, some people can die more than once. And many of you, like myself, will have had the experience of being present at a successful resuscitation. And it's these that lead to many of the dilemmas of determining death that make the ethical decisions we'll be talking about so difficult. And I'm going to talk about some of those associated with brain death first of all. Now, the history of brain death or brain deaths, as I'll explain as we go along, largely dates back to a celebrated report from Harvard Medical School. And then there have been various other stages in its development, and I'll be touching on some of those as we go along as well. But the purpose of that Harvard Medical School committee was to define irreversible coma as a new criteria for death. And an irony really is evident there from the very start, because how can a coma be defined as death? Well, two reasons were given by that committee to try and make that possible. The first was what they described as the burden on patients who suffer permanent loss of intellect, on their families, and they also mentioned the hospitals and those who had need of the hospital beds occupied by those comatose patients. So right from the start, there was a variety of motivations driving this committee. And the second matter of the definition of death being linked with obtaining organs for transplantation is something that has continued right through since then and is very important today. And there were very early indicators of ethical conflict from the very beginning. Cooley, who was a transplant surgeon involved with that committee, said clinicians can become too preoccupied with the rights of the dead at the expense of the recipient. And we shouldn't jeopardize the possible survival of the recipient while we're waiting around to make a decision whether the cadaver, as you call it, is dead or not. Somewhat dismissive view, perhaps. And of course, the legal profession has also been very involved with this. When are you dead enough to be deprived of your heart? Well, in 1980, in the US, the lawyers eventually did legally define death, and they defined it as irreversible cessation of respiratory and circulatory function, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. So at least in the United States, there is a definition. How useful it is, we shall see in a moment. But the UK actually doesn't have a legal definition at all. Now, if you're interested in the full development of these issues, a book that I've read just recently that goes into great detail as to how these definitions of death interwove with the ethical dilemmas precipitating them. This book, The Anticipatory Corpse by Jeffrey Bishop, chapters 4 to 6 of that are a highly critical analysis of the way in which this whole procedure was developed, but a very interesting book, and one that I wish I'd read earlier. Now, this slide comes from a retired professor of neurosurgery. So he's certainly seen a lot of cases of brain death in his time. And as I've already said, there's no legal definition of death in the UK. And it is generally agreed that death is a process. And also, I think, generally agreed that brainstem death, patients diagnosed with that correctly have no prospect of recovery of consciousness. So the majority view is that those correctly diagnosed as being brainstem dead can be considered being dead in law. And I'm not going to go into the code of practice for diagnosis and so on, but of course their respiration and circulatory functions can be maintained by a ventilator. And to the relatives, of course, these patients still appear to be alive, and the emotional trauma to relatives of seeing their loved one pink and breathing apparently is not to be underestimated. But there is still a considerable minority view that questions certain elements of brainstem death equating with death, or whole brain death if it's a country that uses that criteria. And the fact that different criteria apply in different countries is perhaps an area of concern. And D. Alan Schumann is an American neurologist who's written widely on his concerns about some of the assumptions that are made about brain death that are questionable, and takes the view that brainstem death is prognostic rather than diagnostic or determining of death. Now, be that as it may, there are certainly patients who are not brain dead, but are persistently unconscious, that certain ethicists and medics for a long time have been saying we should be considering these people also as dead enough in order to harvest their organs. And I think this is a clear line in the sand for me, where we should very definitely resist this, because patients with these disorders of consciousness are definitely not dead. And it just so happens that last month, a paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, I think, that was taken up by Nature with a Dr. Adrian Owen, who had been measuring the responses of people considered to be totally unconscious using a brain scanner. And one of these patients had been a tennis player, and when spoken to in the scanner to imagine that she was taking a shot at tennis, the appropriate area of the brain lit up. And the headline from that study was that maybe 1/4 of unresponsive people with brain injuries are conscious. And there are certainly a number of biographies available, the best known of which is one called Ghost Boy, about a adolescent who was considered to be permanently unconscious, but who was not, and could hear every conversation that medical staff had around his bed. And Rick Thomas, one of our CMF staff, has just written a blog about this paper and these cases, and concludes that when in the presence of those considered to be unconscious, we should always still speak kindly and mindful of the fact that they are human beings who may actually still be awake. Now, moving on to circulatory dilemmas, and I'm sorry this is a sort of whistle-stop tour, but we'll have time in questions to probably revisit some of these areas. This is a much newer source of a number of ethical dilemmas. In the UK, though we don't have a legal definition of death, these are the Royal College recommendations for the point at which death occurs. So simultaneous and irreversible onset of apnea and unconsciousness in the absence of circulation, with extensive attempts at reversal of any contributing cause having been made. And there are recent advances in the care of those with cardiac problems in hospital that have led to a number of ethical issues, largely in relation to organ transplantation. Now, in deceased donation, in a previous generation, and still now in many places, of course, the organs would be removed, packed in ice, and transported, and the ischemic time would lead to a lower success with cadaveric deceased donations than with organs from living donors. And one of the ways in which this obstacle has been overcome in some cases is by the use of normothermic machine perfusion. Some blood is taken from the donor as well as the organ, and an artificial circulation being set up to continue to perfuse the organ after it's been removed, and transplants using organs that have been preserved by this means are approaching those of living donors. And I don't think this is particularly ethically controversial. But when those organs are oxygenated in situ in the body of the donor, then problems begin to arise. And normothermic regional perfusion is a procedure whereby this can be done, and in this procedure, the patient is declared dead 5 minutes or so after cessation of the circulation. Cessation of the circulation, and then efforts are made to occlude the blood flow to the brain by clamping the arch vessels, including the cerebral arteries. But the rest of the circulation, either just to the abdominal organs or also to the thoracic organs, is maintained by cannulation of the relevant vessels, and the circulation is done via a pump and oxygenated by this system called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And this leads to several ethical problems in connection with the dead donor rule that I'll come to in a moment. But I think for me, one of the central issues concerning this is the reluctance of some clinicians to explain fully to both potential donors and relatives of potential donors what is being done in terms that they can understand and are clear about what's actually being done. And the June issue of the American Journal of Bioethics contained an introduction by a bioethicist at Stanford, which highlighted that for him too, this is really a major issue. And he concludes that introduction to the issue by saying a quick rule of thumb in bioethics should be that relying on not telling people what you're doing or attempting to obfuscate, in other words, to hide the truth with misleading language is a pretty good indication that you're on the wrong track. And while some NRP advocates, this is the perfusion technique I've described, want transparency and complete disclosure, too many leaders and professional organizations have pushed for trying to obscure it. And he says this is at minimum a red flag for this process. And I would entirely agree with that. But two of the other major issues that are real problems, I think, over this process of ECMO and regional perfusion relate to the dead donor rule. Now, this has two formulations. One is that vital organs should only come out from dead patients, and the other one that donors shouldn't be killed in order to obtain their organs. Now, is this going on in the use of ECMO in the way that I've described? Well, death is determined by the Uniform Determination of Death Act in the States as either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function or irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain, including the brain stem. And in the UK, the Working Party says death is determined by simultaneous and irreversible onset of apnea and unconsciousness in the absence of the circulation. Now, I have lost, unfortunately, the slides that go back to the two procedures, just to show the pictures of those again. But the use of the use of the ECMO with the clamping to the arteries of the brain clearly the patient is declared dead by circulatory determination that the circulation has ceased. And then after that, the circulation is restarted again. So it can't be both reversible and irreversible at the same time. So it would seem that the dead donor rule is definitely being violated by that procedure. Those who defend it would say that it's actually only circulation to the brain that counts, and what's being done here is only reperfusion of the organs. But of course, when the thoracic circulation is restored, one of those organs will be the heart that may also start functioning again. Now, there are others who say that the patient is dead because of the state of their brain, that it's been the vessels to the brain have been clamped, and so brain death has arisen. So the patient is dead. But in that case, the cause of death is not the circulatory arrest, but is directly caused by the team that have clamped those arteries. So again, they have brought about the patient's death in order to obtain the organs. So I think whichever way you look at it, this procedure is problematic. And I suspect that will lead to considerable discussion as we enter our time of questions. But in conclusion, I'm just going to make a few reflections that have come to me in the process of putting this talk together. The first thing is that, of course, our bodies, from a Christian perspective, are an earthly tent, and we know that when we die, we will have a new home in heaven and an immortal body. And so it's not like certain strands of Judaism and Islam, where the earthly tent, our physical bodies, have to be preserved in a certain way and may not be tampered with before burial. So from that point of view, I think that there is no objection to deceased donation, and it is a generous thing to do. But on the other hand, dead bodies do matter, and many utilitarian bioethicists take a very cavalier attitude towards the dead body. John Harris at the University of Manchester famously declared that dead bodies don't matter, and that even the wishes of deceased people cease to matter once they've died. Now, that's an extreme view, I think, and clearly, if we see an animal that has been subjected to a roadkill, we may compassionately want to move it to the side of the road. But if it was a human that was hit, we would deal with it very differently. And the Bible teaches that the Lord cares deeply when his loved ones die, and that people like Joseph were concerned about what would happen to their bodies after death. And a related issue is that respecting the requests of the dying are also important, and that's just one example from, again, the book of Genesis. But for me, truth mattering is one of the most important issues of all, as I mentioned it in quoting the comment from the bioethicist from Stanford. And this verse about God desiring truth in our innermost being is really incredibly important. And Paul instructs the church at Ephesus that each one of them must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to our neighbor, because we're all members of one body. And as simply fellow human beings, we're all members of the same human family. And at the very least, we owe it to our patients and their relatives, and to be, I think, upfront about what we're actually doing so that they are in a place to give valid consent in a meaningful way.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you for that that very interesting talk. Lots of issues there. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions coming. We've got a couple already put into the chat. Perhaps I can ask my own question first. What should be our attitude towards people, with this kind of relentless desire to get fresher organs, if you like, for transplantation? As Christians, should we be cynical and say this is kind of utilitarianism and trying to do all we can to kind of pluck resources and put them into people, or should we take a positive view that this is clinicians trying to do the very best to help the recipients and also perhaps to respect the wishes of those who've agreed to have their organs donated after death? Should we be wise as serpents or innocent as doves?
Well, we should be both, shouldn't we? And I think it is a really difficult dilemma, and differs in varying countries. I think for the most part, I am very positive about transplantation and consider it to be, possibly the greatest advance of the 20th century, and the ability to give the gift of life to someone else, whether as a living donor or as a deceased donor, is something that generally I think we should answer with a yes. Unless there are good reasons why not. And I often quote the words of Jesus in this context about greater love has no one than they lay down their life for another. Clearly, hopefully most living donors will not and do not lay down their lives, but the same spirit of self-giving, I think, underlies the giving of an organ, particularly in living donation, but also in deceased donation. And for what it's worth, I am on the register, and should I be suitable in the mode of my death, I would be considered for donation after death. But the issues that have arisen of late have made me very grateful. I've got a medical relative who knows my feelings about things we've been talking about today. And I think we do need to work on having a greater method of say, other than a simple yes or no. And I know other bioethicists are trying to persuade the National Bone Transplant to have a slightly more sophisticated method of indicating our wishes as things get more complicated.
That actually moves.
I hope that's answered your original question.
Well, it links onto another question which someone has put into the chat. And this is from someone called Waltz Lorrimore. And he asks, great job as always, much appreciated. Could I ask a personal question? Are you an organ donor? And if so, what requirements have you prepared for healthcare professionals and loved ones? Have you sort of are there strings attached to your offer of donation, or is it a sort of free gift?
Well, that's kind of thanks very much, Walt. It's we've not met, but your name is familiar, and that's a very probing question. I'll give you a full answer to it. When Britain several years ago moved to an opt-out system without any, as far as I'm aware, public debate. There wasn't any, but I think the Prime Minister at the time thought that she would have an easy win by moving herself that we should change to an opt-out. I did opt out, and about 2.5 million people out of population of 50, 60 million have opted out for various reasons. But after a period of time when I calmed down a bit, I realized that my personal pique against our government was not really a great reason to, or the way that government had acted wasn't really a great reason. So I have opted back in again. But I am very grateful that I actually have a son who is a consultant physician himself, who knows my feelings about brain death and ECMO and so on. And at the present time, I wouldn't want to undergo thoracic perfusion and ECMO. That may change as the systems change. So that's my personal decision. But my broader concern is that with a simple yes, no, a lot of misleading is likely to go on, and indeed has been acknowledged in America. But you yourself may, working in the field, know the sort of state over here and whether we are more upfront with relatives about what's actually going to be done.
Thank you very much. A couple of people have asked questions actually about brain death. So Philip Wood asks, are there unmistakable signs of brainstem death? And Claudia Stein asks, is there any report in the literature of people recovering from brainstem death? Do you think and if not, if no one recovers from brainstem death, is that actually safer than circulatory or respiratory criteria?
Yes, certainly if you Google recovery from brain death, you'll find at least one, if not more, videos of strapping American Midwesterners who presumably were misdiagnosed as being brain dead, living to tell the tale. So clearly diagnostic mistakes can happen. I think if somebody has a total death of their brain stem, my professor of neurosurgery friend has told me that in his entire clinical experience, no one has ever recovered from that. And I'm pretty confident that if it's diagnosed and confirmed correctly, that people are not going to recover. But even as I speak, I'm aware that there is a case in British newspapers at the moment of somebody, I'm not sure of their exact situation, but they were considered to be, this was a child of 4, I think, who was so badly and critically ill that they decided to turn life support off, and she has, I think, she has made recovery to some degree. So I think it's more the borderline cases where diagnoses are uncertain, that if you have a culture that is too gung-ho, or indeed, as I've indicated, bioethicists who are wanting to extend the scope of organ removal from those who are clearly not dead by any criteria, that I find the most worrying thing. And I personally don't have any qualms about having my organs removed from a mistaken diagnosis of brain death in this country at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is very difficult. And I sort of work on the other end of things. I'm a nephrologist, so I look after transplant recipients. And I'd say probably at the moment about half of our deceased donors are brainstem death, and about half have died after circulatory death. And it was a challenge to me as I was coming at this. Are these ethical? Should I be involved in doing donation after brainstem death transplants? Should I be, should I be part of that system? I wonder what you think about the apnea test, which has been sometimes used as a proxy, because that you can use that to determine brainstem death. You switch off the ventilator and see if the person breathes, and if they don't breathe, that sort of confirms brainstem death. And that seemed to me possibly to have some biblical resonance. The breath is breathed into man in the garden, and he becomes a living being. You think of Ezekiel and the dry bones, and the breath of the Lord comes, and then they're alive. Do you think breath is a good biblical proxy for life? Or spontaneous breath, maybe?
Yes, I think that is. I think that is absolutely correct, and my understanding, and again, this will be a dialogue, is that the apnea testing is a standard part of brain death determination, except there are some cases in which it can't be done, and a famous case, pediatric case, a few years ago hit the press. But in most cases, I think it is part of the standard workup, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's not always possible, but yes, exactly as you say, and that to me had increased my
yes, not always possible.
Yes, but that increased my confidence in the concept of brain death, that this person has died in a biblical sense, insofar as you can apply those categories across.
Yes.
Trevor, you'll be pleased to know that you have an invitation to dinner, I think, in Colorado from Walt Lorimore. So if you're ever in Colorado, he says it would be lovely to have dinner. Can I put another?
Thank you very much, Walt.
Could I put another question to you? This one comes from an anonymous attendee. There seems to be increasing societal pressure to consent to organ donation. There may actually be criticism of those who do not consent. How do we defend the right of conscience for the deceased and the families of the deceased? And I suppose linked to that, do you think is there a duty? Is there an ethical duty to be a donor?
I'm not sure I would put it as high as an ethical duty, but I think in the light of the fact that our love is shown by our giving to meet needs that we can, I think there needs to be good reasons why Christians decide not to be donors, deceased donors certainly, and certainly should give thought, if they have a living relative in need of one, of being living donors. But I also think that we get into great difficulties if it's not enough to say that, I want to do it. I think one needs to talk with relatives and so on, because they are very affected as well. And being a deceased donor does alter the way in which you part, and precludes the relatives being sort of present at what they might consider to be your death, and all of those need to be taken into the equation. And I certainly don't think that coercion or deception or telling half-truths is a good way of going about anything. One of the central burdens that made me write the book about the ethics of organ transplantation is that I think it is such an area of good, but it relies entirely upon public trust. And I start the book with a number of sort of famous cases across the globe where various deceptions and downright lying did occur. And in Japan, heart transplants stopped for decades because of one surgeon's deception. So, as Christian physicians, we have and surgeons, we have a huge responsibility to be as transparent as we can be.
Thank you, Trevor. There's a question.
I think continue with your job, David. There's continue doing what you're doing. It's a good.
Yes. There's another anonymous question talking about. Can you comment on withdrawal of treatment for patients on ECMO? Is this ever ethical? How would you think through it? And I suppose if I could maybe clarify perhaps what might have been in the mind of that person. Obviously, there's a broader question about withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. What do you think about these concepts of where you're making treatment decisions for a patient with a view to preserving their organs for transplantation? There's a difficulty there, isn't it? Because you might be treating a patient with a view to keeping them alive a little bit longer so that organs can be more readily used for someone else. What could you talk us through some of the ethics there?
Yes, I will send out either a link or the paper by David Magnus that I referred to earlier on. And he points out there that, of course, ECMO is not only used to preserve organs, but is used to give suitable patients more time to see if their organs will recover. And so he says, what are relatives to think when they ask, if they know about ECMO, is my mother suitable for ECMO? And they're told no, they're not. And then they find out, if they're told about the organ preservation, that they're being put on ECMO. That's a hard thing to ask people to swallow. And although this is allied but slightly differently, I'm very concerned about the ongoing program of xenotransplantation in one or two particular hospitals in the States, where we read in British newspapers that they were told they weren't suitable for a human heart. So they had to have a pig heart, and I'd like that unpicked a bit to find out, what exactly were the criteria there. And always with a pioneering venture, there is the urge to be first. Ordinary transplantation, let's call it that. There are casualties along the way, and people do essentially have to be the first person to have the technique, and are always part of an experiment. But I sometimes wonder whether they are persuaded more than they than they should have been. But one can't know, of course.
Thank you, Trevor. There's a question here from Claudia Stein, it's Stein or Stein, asking about relatives blocking organ donation when the patient has specifically requested it. And she then broadens that out to ask an interesting question about, I suppose, ownership of the body. When someone dies, to whom do their body belong? I guess they've given it up. Is that the possession of the family? Is it the possession of the state? Can the state take organs if the family are against that? What do you think on that question?
I think from the point of view of maximizing organ transplantation, I am pretty much against the vetoing of relatives' decisions. And there's been a lot of discussion in the British press. There was a report out just recently that a lot of people haven't discussed the matter with their relatives. They may think, I haven't opted out, so it'll be okay. But I think it is important to discuss it. But if you have discussed it with relatives, and then for whatever reason, and maybe some of those we've discussed in this seminar, they then decide against, I think that the state forcibly taking that body is bound to lead to trouble. This is a slightly different situation, but one of the cases I discuss in the book is one in Singapore, the Simtua case, where both the potential donor and the relatives had known that he wanted to be a donor. But the hospital was determined to do a transplant that day and insisted on taking the body away, with the grieving relatives still clinging to it and being removed by security guards. And it's no wonder that after that hit the press, there was a big drop in donors in Singapore. So I think bullying people into agreeing may have short-term gain in the what 8 organs that you may gain from that individual, but how many will you lose later on down the track? I think that will be far more.
And then we've had a couple of other questions about, I suppose, about the technicalities really of certifying death. Should we be going for absent breath or absent pulse, fixed pupils? And then also one about how long do you have to wait to determine brain death? I suppose those are more technical questions. And actually, I just had a quick look. And if you put determination of brain death into Google, you come up with some quite good hits. And there's one from the NHS talking about how it's done in the NHS. And there's also quite a recent paper from 2021 from the New England Journal of Medicine looking specifically at that question. So I might perhaps direct people putting those questions to those resources. There's a variety of different criteria that can be used in different countries. Trevor, I wonder if we stop it there. I think it's been absolutely fantastic and a very, very interesting conversation. These are difficult questions, I think. I guess, is there anything you wanted to leave us with? Yeah. Any final thing you wanted to say?
I think there are some things that, are crystal clear in our ethical decision making, but there are others that do have more blurred edges, and even scripture, if we search it from beginning to end, doesn't have clear-cut answers. And I think that the old adage of absolutely drawing the line at your certainties, but having flexibility where there is doubt or ambivalence is really important in this area. And I greatly admire colleagues like yourself and an anaesthetist that we both know who are involved at the front line of doing these things, who are going to be there as the patients and even the deceased patients' defender and stand up for truth and transparency. Those go a long way. Yes, absolutely.
Very helpful. I was reading. It was just. I'll close it in a moment. But I was reading this morning from John's Gospel in chapter 11 about the story of Jesus and Lazarus, someone who's been dead, unquestionably dead, for 4 days in the tomb. And Jesus addresses the grieving family, and Jesus says to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" A great sort of challenge, isn't it, as we face death, that we have such a different perspective and the hope in the resurrection of our Lord. who's alive today physically after his body shut down and died, and the life that he gives to us who believe in him. So Trevor, thank you very much. Thanks everyone who came. God bless you all. We'll end it there.